Alright, so this time we're going to be covering Hypergun, which is a roguelite FPS, and that's something that I like to cover because I really enjoy the roguelite sort of genre or mechanical set, as you've probably noticed. Around the channel I like to cover just about every game in the genre that I can get my hands on and see how they stack up, because I think it is a really interesting and pretty good set of mechanics that can be applied to just about any kind of game, and although some genres take it more easily than others, and others require a lot more careful consideration to make a balanced and actually enjoyable game out of. And FPS is actually one of those, because we don't see a lot of roguelite FPS. And I think the biggest reasons for that are, one, FPS are a bit pricier to make than a lot of other genres, and two, you can really screw it up very easily. You can get into a lot of traps that are fairly common in the roguelite sort of mechanics set that are a bit more acceptable to fans of the genre in other types of games that are a lot less easy to ignore here. Like, for instance, the idea that you often start out with a weapon that is very simple, very basic, not that powerful feeling, and needs to be upgraded a lot with all the various passive items and various things that you get for synergies and all that in order to get really good. You know, think Gungeon or Binding of Isaac or any of those games where you start out with something very basic and it's really not all that satisfying to use, but you can make it better fairly early on. That's just a basic mechanic of the genre, and in FPS that is a lot more difficult to swallow because a first-person shooter needs very satisfying gunplay to really feel good to play. And if you have a very anemic feeling weapon for the first entire level, possibly, then every time you restart, it's not going to be all that fun until you get something really good to play around with. So how does this stack up to all of those kinds of tropes and things? I've personally really enjoyed Ziggurat in this genre. I think Ziggurat was a really, really good attempt and had a lot of really good things going for it. And Immortal Redneck wasn't too bad either because the theme was pretty good and it did a lot of fun things with its weapons and items. But I think this game does, to its credit, one very good thing that Ziggurat also did, which is start you out with something else than your basic weapon from the beginning. What this game is all about is building a gun. You start out with a base gun, depending on what class you are, and there are 4 classes to choose from. You start with 1 unlocked, and you get these hypercoins, which are the sort of meta currency, you know, think hegemony credits or whatever like that, to unlock various things of your choosing after every run. And you gotta save up 50 of them, which actually doesn't take that long, to unlock a new class. And the classes start with an SMG, a shotgun, an assault rifle, which is a 3-shot burst assault rifle, and a sniper rifle. And the idea is all the item drops, the passive item drops that are very common in roguelites, are replaced with gun attachments. And they just, you know, slap them on there and it modifies your weapon in some way. Sometimes entirely positive, like increasing your accuracy and your fire rate and things like that. Sometimes positive and negative, maybe a whole bunch of extra damage at the cost of really reducing your fire rate or your accuracy a bunch. And they can even add a bunch of alternate fire modes, because there are a lot of abilities and sort of activatable things in this game. Every character class has 4 different ability categories with 3 abilities in each, so every character class has 12 separate abilities they can choose from. They start with 4, 1 in each category, and you can unlock the other 2 in each category however you want. And that's pretty cool, because that means every class actually feels quite different, and the fact that every attachment is actually going to be a bit different depending on which character's weapon it actually fits onto. You know, a shotgun that gets extra fire rate and the ability to cause bleed damage is going to be a lot different than, say, a burst fire assault rifle that gets those same attachments. And every character's weapon does indeed react quite differently to what you actually attach to it, which is a good sort of positive for the game. And the overall arenas, as you're seeing here, this is the 3rd level, it's a sort of jungle type level, are very open, quite large most of the time, and they're very much built for mobility. You have a very fast move speed in this game, like arcade FPS level fast move speed, which is good, and you have a double jump from the very beginning. Certain classes can also get the ability to do other things, like one of my favorite ones is the ability to actually have what's effectively a sort of short burst jetpack that allows a sort of 3rd gliding jump after the double jump, which is really cool. It's on a really short, like 5-second cooldown too, so you can use it all the time. And the entire game is very much based around mobility, because there are enemy types that sort of counter, well, standing still. Lots of enemies shoot projectiles that must be dodged. Nothing in this game is hit scan. In fact, one of the base stats of your weapon is shot velocity. That can be increased or decreased depending on what you attach to it. So you can actually have shots that move faster or slower and are thus harder or easier to lead targets with, depending on what you actually attach to your weapon, which is a neat little feature. So another good idea in a roguelite FPS is to have lots of enemies that do this sort of thing. Enemies that have projectiles and dodgeable attacks and things of that nature that make you want to move around the arenas, get mobile, and jump around the place. And this definitely does do that, and the arenas are clearly built for it with lots of verticality. None of them are big, open, flat spaces. They have lots of things like those glass panes there, which help you line of sight enemy projectiles. They have explosive barrels. They have these green squares that you can shoot that activate temporary force fields, all sorts of things like that. There's some interactivity, and also traps, like flaming, spinning flame traps, basically. And some pits that hurt you to stand in, sort of like acid pits and the like. So the arenas are, I think, well designed for the type of game that they're actually going for here. I will say the really large variety in weapon customization that you get in the game is somewhat let down by the other variety in the game, and that is the arena and enemy variety. It's not uncommon to leave a room of a particular level and then go into the next room and it looks exactly the same. There actually aren't a lot of room layouts for each floor, and you'll find that after probably like 2 playthroughs, maybe 3 of each floor, that you will have seen all of the room variants on each one. Which is kind of a shame, although I will admit that I would rather have fewer really well-designed rooms that take advantage of your movement skills and verticality and, you know, different ways to, like, sort of shortcut enemies and send them in various small spaces, depending on what character you're playing and how you actually have your weapon configured, if it's good to have them spread out or have them all lined up in a row, things like that. Then a bunch of rooms that are just sort of slapped together without too much thought and just to get the room count up and, you know, not be sure whether the room I'm going to step in next is actually going to be an enjoyable one or one of the ones I really dislike. I found that pretty much all of the room designs in the game are pretty well designed, in my opinion, and even though there's very few of them for each level, they do actually serve a purpose of being good arenas to fight in, which is good. Although it does get kind of annoying after a couple of plays to, you know, see the same rooms every time. Although I suppose there are people that play the same map over and over again in lots of FPS because they like the map so much. So I guess that's going to depend on what your tolerance is for that sort of thing, but it's something to mention nonetheless. And the other thing I mentioned is the enemy variety. And the enemy variety is unfortunately quite small. There are not that many types of enemies. They are all different. None of them serve the same purpose. Even, you know, multiple projectile firing or multiple melee enemies are not the same and have very different roles in how they actually will fight you and how you have to fight them and how they can synergize with each other, like those drones there that shield enemies, so you have to go after the drones first. You have these swarming flyers that fire somewhat predictable projectiles that are meant to sort of be annoying while you're dealing with things on the ground. You have those mages right there that fire these really annoying projectiles all over the place that you can track along the ground, and you have to sort of counteract along the way. Basically, there's significant, I suppose, role variety is a good way to put it, but not a significant variety of individual enemies, which is kind of a problem. I would like to see, you know, 2 or 3 enemies in each role to increase the variety that you actually have. But yeah, you will be fighting the same enemies in the same arenas each run. And if that bothers you, then that will quickly get old. But I think that, partially at least, the very, very large variety in the actual gun building, which is what the game is mainly based around, does help out with that and sort of balances out the nature of what you're actually using them against, because pretty much every run you're probably going to have something different. As you can see here, there are the 4 characters that you can unlock, And this is the ability layout screen where you can actually choose the different abilities for each slot. You have an item ability, which is consumed. It's consumable. You usually have 3 of them, and you can find power-ups that restore them. A movement ability, sometimes they are triggered and sometimes they're passive. An offensive and a defensive ability, and different combinations of these can be passive or active depending on which you choose. So I guess if you want to play an easier sort of character layout, you can choose more passive abilities, that way you don't have to remember all the cooldowns and actually activating them when they're most useful. Or if you want to be really really active about it, you can choose all usable abilities and manage your cooldowns effectively and stuff like that. So that is cool. I do like that every character has a very different 12 ability set that you can mix and match between, and that every character also starts with a different weapon that reacts very differently to what you attach to it, which is cool and again does add to the variety that is lacking in the other areas. And this is the place where you go to unlock attachments, because that's the other thing that the coins are used for. And you start with a fairly significant pool of attachments. Around, like, I think there are around 100 that you start with the ability to find, and this store allows you to buy more that you get the ability to find. And one thing I like about the store that is not always roguelite tradition is it tells you exactly what you're going to unlock before you unlock it. You can see all the stats and everything, and even what rarity it is, so you'll know how often you're likely to find it before you actually pay for it and grab it, which is nice. The game also has some pretty cool boss fights, so I'm going to show you a couple of those. This is the boss of level 2, Bulwark, who is kind of a pain because he has a lot of health. And I'm using an espresso machine shotgun, so whatever. But it's, the boss fights are very different from each other, which is definitely good. What the game does lack in enemy variety, it does make up for an overall boss variety that, in the way that they all have very different mechanics that are used to actually fight them, and they don't feel samey at all. It's not just shoot it until they're dead. They all pretty much have a different way of fighting them. The first one is this sort of orb that fires these sweeping lasers, and you actually have to shoot the shell off of it before you can actually do any damage to it. And it has rings of lava that you have to avoid stepping into. The Bulwark here is just sort of a straightforward, more warrior, projectile swinging kind of boss that can also call down these big crystal stalactite things from above to crush you, which I didn't actually get footage of. But it can happen, which is horrible, because that really splits your attention between trying to avoid his rushes and big projectiles and getting crushed from above. It's kind of a cool fight, actually. Now, I have noticed some bugginess here and there in certain parts of the game. Nothing game-breaking so far, but a couple of instances where things have sort of went a bit odd, like this guy here that spawned in and his AI just seemed to have shut off, and he just kind of stood there for ever. I don't know why this happens exactly. This is the only time this particular bug has ever appeared for me, but the game does have the occasional bit of oddness to it. Like I said, I've never personally experienced anything too game-breaking myself. Usually it's just AI for someone shutting off, or the corpses going all noodly after you kill them. But I suppose I just kind of wanted to put this in here because I thought it was sort of funny that it happened. It's a bit weird. It's not really rough around the edges, I would say. It's just that sometimes odd things can happen. I just want to put it that way. Now, this is another boss I wanted to show because I just wanted to show some of the later bosses to show that they were different and how the mechanics actually differ as you get later into the game. This is the boss of the third area. He is called Scourge, and he is a really kind of crazy-looking sort of centipede-like creature that is equipped with all these various turrets and things that crawls along this weird goopy ceiling, and the entire floor, as you can see, of the arena, literally the whole thing, is destructible. And the way that it works is Scourge's health gauge is actually split between several different pieces of his body, and each one can take a certain amount of damage before being destroyed, and that piece can no longer fire its various projectile type at you. Some of them shoot rockets, and those rockets can actually come down and destroy pieces of the floor. And it's designed in such a way that he's crawling on the ceiling, and the floor has holes in it, so you're constantly splitting your attention between looking up to actually shoot at him, and looking down to make sure you don't fall into the lava, which is a pretty fun fight, actually, and it tends to last, I think, the right amount of time to not get too overwhelming. This is the boss of the next area up, which is the alien ship level 4. This is called the Overseer, and it is really hard. Actually, I think I've only beaten it once, because it gets pretty crazy pretty quickly. Basically, it is one of those really heavy ad spawning boss fights that just spawns tons and tons of enemies, as well as the boss itself. Now, the boss doesn't actually attack you directly, but it has these 4 sort of mainframe columns that you have to destroy, and every time you destroy one, that takes a chunk of its health gauge, and the boss then pulses out this big sort of buff for every enemy that spawned, which turns them gold, and they double their speed effectively, and swarm you really hard. And then the other columns that are left get shielded for a minute while this is happening, so you have some time to deal with the enemies and not die, hopefully. You repeat this for all 4 of the columns, and then the last bit of the health gauge is taken up by the actual Overseer itself, the sort of AI core in the middle of the ship. And during that phase, I think the pulse of sort of golden enemies actually lasts forever, so it's sort of like a soft enrage where you have to really power the boss down at that point, because you're going to be swarmed with like infinitely spawning very fast enemies for the last very short portion of the boss's health gauge. And it's really hard, actually. And the level after this is a sort of volcanically themed level that I have not yet gotten past. So I would say that if you're into roguelite sort of games like I am, this is a pretty interesting one to check out, because it does do the FPS part fairly well with a really interesting set of weapon attachments that make each run actually feel fairly different. And it is only $15 as well. It is not an expensive game, so even though the variety falls short in the room variety and enemy variety departments, the overall sort of class and weapon sets that you can get do help to alleviate that somewhat, and the overall movement and shooting is satisfying and enjoyable, and for 15 bucks, I'd say it's actually a pretty good go. So, that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you very much for watching. Try not to get killed by the AI core, and I'll see you guys next time.